Did not you hear me ask him about the slave trade last night? I did, and was in hopes the question would be followed up by others. It would have pleased your uncle to be inquired of farther, and I longed to do it. But there was such a dead silence. This is a quote from Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, which details an exchange between the main character, Fanny Price, and her eventual love interest, Edmund Bertram, where Fanny reveals the knowledge and interest in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the reception with which this question was met. A dead silence. In order for us to understand the significance of this question and the silence with which it was met, we need to contextualize slavery within the novel. Thomas Bertram is the only Jane Austen character serving as a member of the Parliament, residing during the abolition debate as well as the 1807 Slave Trade Act, which moved to effectively abolish the slave trade on British soil, at least on paper. It was considered a huge win for the British abolition movement at the time. The timeline of Mansfield Park differs between scholars, some suggesting that Thomas Bertram would have returned from his plantation in Antigua sometime in 1808, others suggesting that he would have done so in around 1813. Regardless of the date, it is quite clear that during his stay in his plantation in Antigua, the slave trade would have effectively been abolished in the British Empire. To be fair though, just as a side note, but not really a side note, slavery as a socio-economic institution was not actually abolished until 1833 in Britain, but the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1807. Britain continued its abolitionist pressure on other European countries during the Napoleonic Wars, mainly to gain high moral ground against France, for example, who reinstated its slave trade after Napoleon went into power. Austen herself, who was a self-proclaimed fan of an abolitionist campaigner, Clarkson, would have been invested in the political intrigue surrounding the transatlantic slave trade. Austen clearly suggests, at least, that she is thinking about slavery, she is interested in slavery to a certain extent, and she is willing to put the concept of slavery and its discussion in her novels. Austen is famously a critic of manners and of English way of life and high society, so it is not exactly surprising that she would bring up a topic like slavery. When Fanny poses her question to Sir Bertram about slavery, she is met with this dead silence. This suggests that the topic of slavery in the Bertram household is not only sensitive and maybe taboo, it also suggests that Fanny expects Sir Bertram to be knowledgeable on this topic, seeing as he was just in his plantation in Antigua, seeing the effects of abolition in real time. He would have been privy to the debates going on in the Parliament at the time between those for abolition and those against it. This almost throwaway line in Mansfield Park can mean many different things. Maybe the topic of slavery was just too awkward for Sir Bertram to discuss because he presumably just lost a lot of his income due to the abolition. Maybe he was just extremely disappointed in the British government in abolishing the transatlantic slave trade on British soil, and he continued to exercise the slave trade illegally. Or maybe it means nothing at all, and this is just a plot device to drive the conversation forward between Fanny and Edmund as a romance. But since we're talking about Jane Austen here, I do believe that there is significance in this line. I do not believe that it is meaningless at all. Given the proximity of the Bertrams to the transatlantic slave trade, as well as how interested Jane Austen herself was in the abolition of the slave trade, it is far more likely that the dead silence is supposed to signify the discomfort and maybe certain evils of English high society. The Bertrams are the villains of Mansfield Park. They fit that narrative of an abusive, villainous family for the most part that almost fit the mold of a Gothic novel villain. If Jane Austen wrote genuine Gothic novels, Northanger Abbey is a parody, so it doesn't count. The Bertrams represent abuse of power, negligence, and weak moral compass, which we can see through their putting on the Lover's Vows play, as well as how they treat Fanny Price. Knowing what we know with the context of Jane Austen being a sympathizer of the abolitionists and the Bertrams being the villains in Mansfield Park, is it then too far-fetched to suggest that with the dead silence that Fanny's question is met, Jane Austen is trying to communicate to us that the Bertrams were perhaps sympathetic of the transatlantic slave trade? Of course, it must also be discussed that within the Austen novels, slavery exists as a means of rich white families to exist. At the end of the day, while Jane Austen might have been establishing her abolitionist ideas, or at least hinting at them in her novels, slavery is still something that is a primary source of income for the Bertrams, as well as for the Mrs. Smith in Persuasion. Mrs. Smith is entitled to a West Indian plantation which she inherited from her deceased husband, I believe, which she cannot gain access to legally until Anne Elliot helps her. Anne Elliot is able to be viewed by us as a good moral character because she helps her friend essentially use slave labor for profit. Slavery makes it possible for characters to be wealthy, not only as a means of establishing their evils, like in the Bertram's case, but also as a means of establishing their virtue, like with Anne Elliot. Austen demonstrates the other primary property that whiteness holds for itself: the capacity to be seen as good, regardless of the consequences of one's actions outside of the realm of one's primary operations. The author Aaron Goss reminds us of the very off-page nature of Jane Austen's discussions of slavery in her novels. We can read as much as we want into her novels in hopes that we draw the conclusion that Austen herself was on the right side of history with all of this. The point still stands that Jane Austen, a renowned critic of the English fine society, chose not to discuss slavery outright. She chose to be quite vague. She chose to use hints. She chose for these throwaway comments to mean something, maybe, but the point still stands that these comments still are throwaway comments. We know that she was a critic of the attitudes against women in the Regency era England, which is quite clear throughout her novels, but her criticism of things like slavery is not that apparent. If Austen has herself learned about abolition and an increasing recognition of slavery's horrors, as many critics claim she has done, her novels show that she has also learned that slavery as a topic is best buried and kept fully off the page. White women's goodness makes for a much more palatable topic. I'm also going to go a little bit deeper into this topic in another video, but I just wanted to mention the concept of war in Jane Austen's novels and the way that Jane Austen is patriotic about England in her novels. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, England was pushing the abolitionist agenda because of the Napoleonic Wars and the fact that France reinstated the transatlantic slave trade, and the British wanted to gain the high ground against that. I think regardless of motivations, I think that being an abolitionist is good. So I don't think that it matters much that they only did it because they wanted to gain the high ground against the French, but the context is still there. They weren't exactly going and doing this because they were just so concerned with the human rights aspect of it all. I mean, maybe they were, but I think that the primary indicator, the primary force behind the abolition was to gain the high ground against the French. And so we can also see this in Jane Austen's novels as well. Because she was so patriotic, because she grew up during the Napoleonic Wars, we can see that she maybe reflects kind of a similar mentality. She may very well be an abolitionist because she truly hates the heinous human rights violation that is chattel slavery. But we also are not 100% convinced of that from her novels. Her abolitionist subtext in her novels, as little as little of which there is in her novels, may be very well driven by her desire to see England win in the Napoleonic Wars rather than anything else, rather than a desire for human rights to prevail, if that makes sense.